right around the time the U.S. published its first public U.S. Arctic policy. Commonwealth North did this report called Why the Arctic Matters, America's Responsibilities as an Arctic Nation. Our study group this summer and fall is preparing an update to that report. Our co-chairs, besides myself, are Admiral Tom Barrett, former U.S. Coast Guard, former Acting Secretary of Transportation, Bob Cox, who's a transportation industry expert here, and someone who has worked on delivery of energy to Western Alaska, Maura Backenstedt with Ogunik Corporation, and Gail Schubert, the chairman of Bering Straits Native Corporation. I also just want to thank our collaborators besides the Institute of the North, who's helped arrange this program today, General Key at the Arctic Domain Awareness Center, Rachel Calander at Arctic Encounter Symposium, Mike Sprague at the Wilson Center Polar Research Policy Institute, Alice Rogoff at Arctic Today, Sprague at the Wilson Center Polar Institute, Dwayne Menendez at the Polar Research Policy Institute, and Alice Rogoff at Arctic Today. And with that, I'm going to turn the program over to Ian. And General, thank you again very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mead.
Thank you, Mead. As Mead said, I'm Ian Lang. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of the North. We are a nonpartisan think tank based in Anchorage, and we're really focused on doing the most with the resources that we hold in common. We do a lot of work in Alaska, but one of the other main areas of interest for us is the Arctic, where we've been very active in managing different projects for the Arctic Council, producing the Arctic Energy Summit, Marine Shipping Assessment, the Arctic Energy Renewable Atlas, and a variety of other things. And we're part of this Arctic Policy Study Group that Mead helped put together, and are very honored to sponsor today's presentation on the national security challenges and opportunities associated with a warming Arctic. This talk is also being brought to you by the American Security Project, which is a nonpartisan organization that was created to help educate Americans and actually, I believe, the broader world on the changing nature of national security in the 21st century. And they do a lot of things, but one of their primary missions is to engage citizens and opinion leaders like those here at Commonwealth North through dialogues like this to help increase public understanding, explore differing viewpoints, and ultimately build bipartisan consensus around real concrete actions that help America respond appropriately to its various security challenges. Of course, we're fortunate enough to have someone here today to tell you a lot more about the organization and, of course, the national security landscape, and that is the president of the American Security Project, Brigadier General Stephen Cheney. He's a graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy. He has over 30 years of experience as a Marine. He has served in a whole variety of command and staff positions in both the operating forces and within the supporting establishment. I've only just met the general today, but his resume reads with all the fancy titles and accolades and gravitas one might expect of a general. Commanding General at Parris Island, Inspector General of the Marine Corps, Congressional Liaison, Fellow, CEO, COO, the list goes on. You can get his full resume in the event notes here. But I want to highlight just a couple of positions that are of particular relevance to our Arctic policy focus today, including his service on the study group with the State Department's International Security Advisory Board, which wrote the report on Arctic policy in 2016, and also his 2017 membership on the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force that produced the report Arctic Imperatives. So with that, I'll thank the General for giving us his time today and turn it over to him.
Ian, thank you, and Mead, thank you as well. I often open my talks with a line that I attribute to Churchill, but I'm not sure it's his. But since the speed of light travels faster than the speed of sound, some people appear bright until you hear them speak. I hope I don't prove that axiom true, and I'm not sure how that works with the electronic side of the world, but I'll revert to another one of my quotes from King Henry VIII, who told several of his wives, I won't keep you very long. So just a little precursor, I'm going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open up to a wide-ranging Q&A. I want to thank certainly Commonwealth North, the Institute of the North, the Association for Defense Communities, and my own ASPs, Alex Hepworth. Thank you all for helping put this together. Let me talk for a minute or two about the American Security Project. And we're a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization focused on the long-term national security threats that face the United States. And it was formed in 2005, 2006, coming off the 2004 election, where a certain Senator Kerry was not very happy with the outcome of the election. And he was particularly upset when he brought up specific topics, in particular climate change, when he got painted as the left-wing liberal that he is, and people didn't pay much attention to him, and it became a very partisan issue. So his thought at the time was, how can I raise this issue and perhaps take the partisanship out of it and let people understand the national security implications of climate change? And his initial thought was, let's put together a group of recently retired military officers, 3- and 4-star level, 2 from each service, put them on a board and let them speak about these issues, but take the politics out of it. And that is indeed how it started. Now, he had 4 senators that active at the time that helped put it together, Hart, Kerry, Rudman, and himself, and 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. But they pulled out of the partisan side of it and let the retired military guys run it. And then we pulled in some business folks to help fund the organization, and we pretty much stayed the same since then. We still have several of those original folks still on our board. One's a former superintendent of West Point. One's a former vice chief of the Air Force. We had another Central Command commander, another Pacific Command commander, pretty distinguished folks. Now let me go back to ASP in itself. Our research, we examine topics like nuclear nonproliferation, counterterrorism, energy security, and of course today's topic, which is climate security. And we have worked on climate change as a threat to our national security literally since our founding. One of the unique features of the American Security Project and our climate security work is our National Climate Security Tour. And since I became the CEO in 2011, we've had funded tours all over the country, and matter of fact, all over the world, where we take many of our folks and talk climate change and climate security. And part of that tour, we rely on an organization called the Consensus for American Security. And what we did was we understood that just those 8 men and women, I might add, weren't enough. We needed a much broader base to help talk about this issue. So we expanded it greatly to a group that's got 80+ consensus members. We also included national security leaders, ambassadors, SES folks who serve in very high positions in many administrations, and we lean on them to help pass this message out. They work together and they develop a consensus around strategic national security issues that face the country, such as nuclear weapons, energy and climate security, terrorism, economic competitiveness like trade, public diplomacy, and national security strategy. And our members host forums and other public events to educate decision makers about the dangers of today's threats. And we do a lot of media work, encourage smart and nonpartisan discourse among policymakers. So with that, let's go to the next slide, Alex. I am not a scientist. Now we have scientists in our consensus. One of them is Admiral Dave Titley, who runs the climate program at Penn State University. He was the former chief meteorologist for the Navy. And I will tell you, he was a denier, and he's a true convert now, talking about climate change. And he talks about the science, and I am not going to talk about the science. In my opinion, the science is established, and it's generally, almost universally agreed upon. Some would say that 97% of the climate scientists agree with these basic facts. Sure, there's 3% that don't. But overwhelmingly, the data supports that the world is warming, and it's warming at a fast rate, and we're causing that warming. And you all in Alaska are on the forefront of this. So, okay, Alex, let's go to the next slide. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is our good friend, Senator Inhofe from Oklahoma, and he's on the floor of the Senate holding a snowball from a snowstorm that happened that particular day in February a couple of years back, and he said, "This is climate change. These are what these people are seeing in climate change." Of course, he was ridiculing the 97%. You just take one event out of the many, you're not going to get good statistical data. When you go over 100 or 200 years and look at it, you can see how the temperature has been increasing, and we know that the Earth is warming. You know, alternative explanations have been thoroughly debunked by scientists, particularly on cable news, where you find that debate today. So let me talk about the Arctic and national security challenges and opportunities in the Arctic. And as Alaskans, you certainly know that the climate is changing. You're literally on this front line. You see and feel the effects daily. We were talking earlier this time last summer, Alaska was really having a tough go of it. July 2019 was Alaska's hottest month on record. In August, you had erratic and unusual precipitation. You had downpours in some parts, huge fires. You had water restrictions in others. And now this year, you're having not quite the repeat, but pretty close. Some of the hottest average temperatures in May in the world were in Alaska. And Alaska and the rest of the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. And that indeed is a huge problem. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that climate change in the Arctic is threatening the American homeland. Now, some don't think it that way, but I'll talk about this here in a second. Today, ensuring America's security does not just mean protecting our borders from external threats like terrorists or immigration. It's other things. Threats like melting sea ice, thawing permafrost certainly have huge national security implications in the long run. Americans' military bases like Alaska's Forts Greely, Wainwright, Richardson, your Air Force bases like Ilsen, Elmendorf, are all directly threatened by climate change, certainly through primary thawing of the permafrost. Let's go to the next slide, Alex. Climate security, renewed geopolitical significance. The region's renewed geopolitical significance shines a huge light on these challenges. And Alaska has always been of huge strategic importance to the United States national security interests. You are all familiar that Secretary of State William Seward bought the territory from Russia in 1867, partly to gain an American foothold in the Pacific. Alaska became obviously a wartime theater in World War II during the Aleutian Islands campaign, and in revitalized strategic importance as the Cold War began, since the shortest geographical route between the United States and then the Soviet Union was a straight line across the North Pole, and the northern latitudes provided the optimal path for the approach of Soviet nuclear missiles. However, the warming Arctic puts Alaska on the front lines now of great power competition, and you see those flags I have on the slide here of China and Russia. They have both expressed and demonstrated their interest in opening the Arctic. And the US should be equally as clear about our interests and our intentions. Now, as was previously mentioned by Meade and Ian, I was on the State Department's International Security Advisory Board in 2016 when we published a paper on the Arctic, and it's online, you can pull it up. It underscored the national security significance of the Arctic and the important role the US can play in regional affairs. And we had 6 very specific policy recommendations in that particular paper. First, the United States must continue to lead on Arctic safety, security, and stewardship. Second, the United States should promptly ratify the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, and that's long been an issue with the American Security Project. Third, the United States should increase its presence and domain awareness in the Arctic. Fourth, we need to continue to strengthen our alliances and partnerships, including with the Arctic Council nations, observers, and other partners. Fifth, we should adopt policies and practices to deal with the Russian dimension of the Arctic developments. And sixth, transparency and confidence building measures should be strengthened to reduce the risk of miscalculation or accident. I think somewhat sadly, 4 years later, many of those recommendations from the advisory board have yet to be implemented, but there is some daylight that we've seen from the incumbent administration here, particularly in the last couple of months, that they're becoming much more aware of what's happening in Alaska and the Arctic and starting to make some changes. Unfortunately, when they came in, they disbanded the International Security Advisory Board. They did away with the position of representative, senior representative to the Arctic Council. But now they have started to reinstitute some of those, and I'll talk about it here in a minute. The Arctic security significance has only increased in these last 4 years, and as U.S. Northcom's Commander General O'Shaughnessy said during his testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee this past February, just this past February, the Arctic is the first line of defense. So here, let me outline some of the challenges. The first challenge is the need to establish rules and norms for opening the Arctic. Some have described the Arctic as the new Wild West. I don't necessarily agree with that characterization. In fact, I think it's been somewhat fairly regulated. Although now with the melting and the competition, some of those norms are being bypassed. We certainly need to have rules for increased vessel traffic, resource exploration, research, fishing, amongst many other things. We need to establish rules to help mitigate maritime accidents, conflicts over fishing grounds, disasters, and potential miscommunication between great powers. And as such, one of our favorite lines at the ASP is that the US Senate should immediately ratify the UN Convention on Law of the Sea. Although I'll tell you candidly, I've been working that issue for some 9 years. There is treaty aversion in the Senate, and it's not just on the Republican side, it's on both sides. It's been very difficult to bring it up. But nonetheless, when we are one of the few countries in the world who have not signed up for it, and there's many other countries that not only have signed up for it, have put claims in front of UNCLOS to include Canada and Russia specifically, and those claims will get adjudicated, and we have no say in it, no say whatsoever. So doing so will give us credibility when it promotes freedom of navigation in Arctic waters. The second big challenge is your thawing permafrost. It's certainly threatening our military infrastructure. It's critical for the U.S. ability to defend the homeland, and it's certainly necessary, or we ought to watch it when we try to project force. We have to ensure that existing military infrastructure and any new construction, of course, is climate resilient, especially in the face of thawing permafrost. I would say I think we need to establish more bases and stations up there. We certainly need a deep water port. There are plenty of places you can put it. But I think as we watch what's going on with Russia and Canada as well, I might add, that having more availability up there and more shipping, more US shipping is a better thing. We need more icebreakers. Now there is where I said there's been a little more daylight with the current administration because they've now started funding for 2 more new icebreakers. We have 2 icebreakers right now, a medium and a heavy. You're probably familiar. The heavy one breaks down about half the time. Another half the time it spends its time in Antarctica. I mean, we are so woefully inadequate in that realm. And just look at China. China's got at least 2 active icebreakers, and they're building a 3rd and a 4th. This is China. They're not an Arctic nation. Russia, of course, is the ringleader on this one. With 50% of the Arctic border is Russian. They have 40 or more, 40 active icebreakers, and they got 11 under construction. But like I said, there's some daylight here. And one of the study groups I was with at the Council on Foreign Relations, one of the co-hosts or co-authors of that was Admiral Thad Allen, former Commandant of the Coast Guard. And his strong belief was we need at least 6 icebreakers. And I think I agree with him on that. Fourth, the U.S. lacks a military deep water port in Alaska. The U.S. has had some recent activity in the Arctic. The Second Fleet has been given Navy responsibility for the Arctic. They've had some recent exercises, particularly with Norway. But there is some confusion in the military about who's responsible for the Arctic and who's not. And that comes under what we call the Unified Command Plan. And it's split somewhat between the Pacific Command, the European Command, and Northern Command. Right now, Northern Command holds operational control of activities in the Arctic. That ought to be clarified better. There are some who are calling for a new numbered fleet in the Arctic. I saw a recent article where a Navy admiral, the admiral that commands the Second Fleet, didn't think that was necessary, but I think that's something that needs to be considered in the long run. Fifth, communications in the high north have always been very challenging and difficult. But when you see traffic increasing, reliable communications are going to be so much more critical up there in north. If we put up a geosynchronous satellite to help enhance communications, that would be a wonderful, wonderful thing. Now, that all said, with challenge comes opportunity. While a warming Arctic is not necessarily ideal, it does present an opportunity for the U.S. to reassert itself as a global leader and more actively engage in Arctic affairs. We need to more constructively engage with the Arctic Council and its partner members to ensure the Arctic remains peaceful. One of the sad parts about the Arctic Council, I say sad, some say it's a good thing, is they're excluded by their own charter for discussing security matters. So there really is no mechanism among the 8 Arctic nations to discuss national security, and there ought to be. And there are a number of models you can follow to create something like that. I think it would be a great project for any administration to start something like that up, to have them all the chiefs of defense talking about security models. Let me talk energy security, and let's go to the next slide, Alex. You know, we all know that Alaska and the Arctic are rich with natural resources. Climate change and advancements in technology have made it much easier to explore and develop these resources. And given the high potential, of the high North minerals and natural resources, there will be increased competition, and it's going to pose some big challenges for us. You know, first off, it's likely that other nations are going to have similar natural resource exploration and development interest in the Arctic. Of course, Russia and Canada, but increasingly China. It's critical that the United States takes an active role and establish sustainable and peaceful rules of engagement on this exploration and development. The heated conflicts in the South China Sea that you've seen between us and China, which now is getting very, very scary in my opinion. We don't want to see that type of a conflict moving north into the Arctic, and with the potential for other countries moving up and through there, particularly China, it has that potential. Second, exploring, developing, extracting some of these natural resources and minerals may prove hazardous to the environment. You certainly know in Alaska how devastating an oil spill can be. Just look at the recent oil spill or diesel spill in Russia. It's problematic. The US and its companies should establish best practices, and the US is perhaps the best country at extraction on these things for resource exploration and development in the north to ensure that our fragile ecosystems are protected and we don't get another Valdez oil spill. Third, development of Alaska's oil and natural gas reserves will help accelerate Alaska's warming. There's no doubt about it. Putting CO2 in the atmosphere is contributing to this climate change, and buying and getting more gas and oil is going to contribute to that. And not to mention that demand for oil is down at almost record lows, and COVID-19 has only decreased the demand for future oil as people aren't driving as much. So oil has become cheaper. We at ASP have viewed natural gas as a bridge fuel. And I say a bridge fuel, it's bridging from CO2 or fossil burning fuels into renewables. So with that, I say we could go into what's called diversifying your state's energy portfolio and use it to have renewables, particularly wind and solar. Now, Alaska isn't now new to either wind or solar. You're investing in solar. The Kotzebue Electric Association just finished the installation of a 576 kilowatt solar farm north of the Arctic Circle. And they hope to generate 50% of its electricity from renewables, and the consumer will see that likely in the utility bills going down. Alaskan officials would do well to harness this additional energy while planning for longer-term diversification and resilience. I would add that the United States has just appointed a new Arctic czar to coordinate our activities in the Arctic across the interagency here in DC. It's a career Foreign Service officer named James DeHart, just announced, I believe, last week, which just makes my heart happy, to be honest with you. Somebody who can coordinate that. He's not a politico. He understands it. He's been stationed in the embassy in Norway for many years before. So there is some hope on this horizon. Alex, let's go to the seventh slide. America is only an Arctic state because of Alaska. But Alaska is bearing the brunt of this global climate change. And sad to say, I think a significant portion of America just doesn't get it. Any comprehensive U.S. strategy for the Arctic has to begin by helping Alaska meet the challenges and embrace the opportunities now of its rapid warming. While there are opportunities in the Arctic, we can't lose sight of what's causing Alaska's warming and forever altering the high north. Climate change caused in part by carbon emissions. Once the Arctic ice is gone, and it's gone. And that's going to have huge global implications. Changing weather patterns, sea level rise, competition. The risks of a warming climate in Alaska and everywhere, quite frankly, should not be underestimated. We've got to reduce our carbon emissions. We've got to find alternative energy sources. And if we don't address these risks posed by climate change, our national security interests are going to be threatened, and Alaska will be the first to feel these effects. Alaska cannot afford for us, the United States, to ignore the risks of a changing climate. So I hope that's not too dire a message coming from a former military guy, but there's so many implications here, and there's so much involved in our national security strategy. And I think the incumbent administration is waking up to this reality. Now, regardless of what happens in November, we're starting to move in the right direction here. So there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot of questions. I think you need a lot of help. And with that, I'll turn it back over to you, Ian or Mead. Maybe not.
Well, I don't really have any. This is Ian. I don't really have any questions for you at the moment. There's a lot to chew on there. Mead, how about you?
Sure, General. Thank you very much. And just a couple of thoughts and comments real fast with some questions. And I want to remind folks that you can use the chat form on Zoom here for questions and a discussion. I was present, I guess Ian was as well, last October with Secretary Kerry in Iceland. And of course, we were with him here when he and the president came here last year, or a couple of years ago in 2016. And I guess I've got a question about two things that you said about energy security. Alaska does produce oil, and I was part of the response to Exxon Valdez. I was certainly part of the initiatives that came after Exxon Valdez to set up spill prevention response capabilities. We have a group called Alaska Clean Seas in the Arctic that works on this very well. And I would say that no Alaskan I know wants to live through wants to see another oil spill. We work very hard on that. But I guess the question is, when you make the statement that producing energy here helps make the climate worse for Alaska, how does energy production here do anything worse for Alaska in terms of climate compared to, say, production in Canada or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or any other place in the world? And second, as a security expert, can you acknowledge, at least the fact that U.S. production, I mean, for the last 30 years, we've been told by administrations left and right that producing in America was better for America than producing and relying on unstable sources elsewhere in the world. And I guess what I'm getting at is ASP, I think all of us can accept an agenda that says try to wean ourselves away from oil or make oil more benign and rich fuel of gas work. But is AFP kind of against production in Alaska while they support production in other places, or what's the situation?
No, I mean, I think, we look long term, we understand what CO2 is doing to the environment and doing to the atmosphere, and we know what causes it: the burning of fossil fuels worldwide. I mean, it's a worldwide thing, and we know it. I mean, that's proven. So ultimately, we would like to get out of burning fossil fuels. Now, I think we clearly understand that near term, that ain't going to happen. I mean, we are so dependent worldwide on burning fossil fuels, and it's not just oil. Coal coal is perhaps the bad one. And we have an incumbent president who said the war on coal is over. And he was right. He was right because coal has become now so dirty and so bad, and natural gas has become so cheap that it's put them out of business. And they'll never come back, but you still see coal being burned in some quantities in both India and China. So ASP is, we're against burning of fossil fuels, period. Ultimately, we'd like to see a total shift to renewables, something that doesn't contribute CO2 to the atmosphere. But we are realistic about it. We understand that it isn't going to happen overnight, that fracking and other things are still going on. And you can look at the U.S. as a net exporter today of fossil fuel, of oil, which you wouldn't have believed would have happened a decade ago. But I think our reliance on that continues to need to be cut down. And Alaska, of course, given your location and the proximity, the huge distances where for instance, if you've got villages that have to import diesel to power themselves up where they can use renewables instead of importing fossil fuels, one, there's a savings there, and secondly, you're not contributing CO2 to the environment. But I think we understand at ASP that long-term, Alaska is not going to stop drilling for oil or selling oil. I mean, that's going to continue for years to come, and we're realistic about it. Would we like to see a shift to natural gas? Certainly. And then we'd like to see us get off natural gas, go into renewables? Of course. So I think that's perhaps a more realistic perspective on that question.
Thank you. And as this study group kind of works on this issue, I think General, I think you'll find Alaskans are very aware of both the impacts of climate change as well as the causes. I think we've got our eye on technologies that can make oil and natural gas, even coal, more benign. And when I say that, there are a number of coal to hydrogen projects in the world. There are a number of gas to hydrogen projects in the world that may reduce this, and we are working very hard. We've invested billions of dollars so far without effect to try to commercialize natural gas, and we'd like to do that. But I guess the question is this policy is advanced so often in the United States, the leave it in the ground crowd, would in essence harm American production first. We've got no way to govern Saudi production. We've got no way to govern Venezuelan production, and we've got safer environmental issues. So it's that kind of dialogue that we're trying to figure out how to have with the nation and the world, which says that we're working on alternatives and support working on alternatives, but don't penalize us when others are going ahead full bore.
That's a great question, because when you look at the countries that are totally oil dependent, particularly in the Middle East, and I did a lot of study in Oman for a while, which 80% of their income is from oil and oil exploitation. And whenever the price, as we know, drops dramatically, which Saudi Arabia did by putting the glut under the market, and it kills those economies. Russia's the one who's really being crushed by it. So you want to wean yourself off of that dependency, off of that one type of commodity. Otherwise, you're at the whims of whatever's going to happen in the market. Look at the fracking industry. They are going under left and right because the price of oil is so low that now they can't compete. So I would think Alaska I would put you in the same box, that ultimately you'd like to wean yourself off of an oil-based economy. And you certainly have. I mean, you've got many other sources of bringing in funds for your state. So, but to have it so dependent, and I have to mention something about coal. People say clean coal, and such an oxymoron. When you burn coal, you burn it, and it puts out CO2. Now there are ways of capturing CO2, and there's a lot of people been working on that. It just hasn't worked out the way it should work out long term necessarily. But I think diversifying your economy, diversifying your energy sources are a much more reasonable way to go about doing that. And that includes nuclear power, for instance. Some ASP has been criticized in the past for being supporters of nuclear power. We have been supporters of it for quite a long time because nuclear is pretty clean. We won't get into that. It's got its own drawbacks, of course. But I get where you're coming from on the oil and gas for Alaska.
Well, and thank you for the understanding. A second question prompted by your remarks is you talked about law of the sea, and just a little bit of history here in Alaska. The current law of the sea treaty came out of a negotiation called by the Nixon administration. At the point that was called, Alaska had a statewide commission, had observers on the whole law of the sea negotiation. The law of the sea brought us, we unilaterally went to the 200-mile limit, though it was accepted by the law of the sea negotiation. That allowed us to protect our fisheries and bring hundreds of millions of dollars a year of economic activity home to Alaskans. So that was positive. It helped us throw out foreign carriers who weren't, foreign fishing groups that weren't following consistent science and so forth. And I think Alaskans understand that we certainly supported what was an $80 million appropriation Ted Stevens arranged to do the mapping of our potential claim under law of the sea in the Arctic, which could be almost 2 Californias. As a question who've looked at how this issue is dealt with here, this is a red hot third rail of Alaska politics. It helped determine a Senate race I was in, where if you said anything good about law of the sea, you must not have been a patriot. When you go back and peel the layers of the onion with the conservative groups who've been opposing this, it's generally opposed to the first global tax with that Jamaica has, or that you put in the International Seabed Authority on Jamaica on sharing revenues from deep seabed mining. And do you see any sort of compromise that can let us get the land and claim the land that we have pending in the Arctic, and B, kind of ratify that what we're doing in terms of freedom of navigation and fishing without setting up this global tax that's there that is the real objection in Washington?
Yeah, I think two of the biggest claimants under law of the sea today are Russia and Canada. Russia's got 2 big claims in to expand their EEZ another couple 100 miles. And of course, Canada and the US are in a fight over the Bering Strait and have been for years. But I certainly, anytime you mention the word tax, people run the other way. I mean, they don't want anything to do with the money side of the house. So I guess in answer to your question, if you remove the monetary side of it and just use it as a arbitration facility, then that might be one way to maybe bring it to the Congress. As you probably know, the US signed it, but it never got ratified by Congress. So, when we worked hard on this in 2011, 2012, and it just couldn't gather up enough support to bring it to the floor, and it certainly wasn't going to get 60 or 70% of the Senate side of the House. So between you and me, I'll push it. I just don't hold much hope for it.
Okay, thank you. And the third question I wanted to raise, just also in response to your remarks, is you thank you. I guess I'll say on behalf of many of us who've been participating in this process all summer. We've talked a lot about deep water ports. A couple things to be aware of. We had the mayor of Kotzebue, as she was talking about, or the mayor of the Northwest Arctic Borough, as she was talking about ways to get Cape Blossom funded. It's right now a 70-30 split where the state and the locality are really required to come up with 70% of the cost of this. The cost for a deep water port in Nome is over $500 million. Cost of a road to Port Clarence may be in the $50 to $100 million range, I don't have current figures on that. And I guess the question that I've got is, because of the strategic value of this, should there be greater federal help in investing in this infrastructure? And as someone who's been in the challenges of funding our defense budget, where should that come from?
Well, don't take this the wrong way. 500 million ain't all that much when you look at the defense budget. You know, when you're talking almost $1 trillion or $700 billion, you know, 500 million is a relatively small amount in that regard. And I think what you're seeing now, certainly the Coast Guard's in favor of it, definitely. And now the Navy is starting to shift dramatically towards it. That we ought to have a deep water port in Alaska, whether you have it in Nome or Adak or wherever. And that base has to be federally funded, in my opinion. I mean, if you're going to have the Coast Guard and the Navy using it, which are federal entities under the Department of Defense as far as the Navy goes, and DHS as far as the Coast Guard goes, it would have to be federally funded. And now, you know, we've been working on, let me give you an analogy. We've been working on the icebreaker issue for, well, 2016 was my first, you know, with the CFR and the ISAB, but we finally got progress. You know, we're getting funding for 2 of them, and maybe we'll get funding for another couple after that, another couple. So I guess my point to that is that you should put the base realignment or a base opening in the same basket and say, let's start thinking long-term here and look at, you do it through the National Defense Authorization Act, putting some funding aside to start the research and start the planning to put a deep water port into Alaska. And that's how, and you got to keep pushing. You can't stop. You got to keep pushing. And now when you see what's going on in the Arctic, and it's not going to take one calamity or one incident up there before, how come we don't have more assets up there? And you know, hindsight's wonderful in Congress. You know, we should have done something about that. Look at 911. So, I mean, but now is the time to start pushing for it. And it ought to be federally funded. There's no doubt about it in my mind.
Well, thank you. And if we make that same recommendation, we hope you can endorse that from ASP.
We would.
Juanetta, do you have some questions that we have? Generally, normally what we do in this is we've got a group of people listening, and they've been sending in questions to Juanetta, so I'm going to pass the gavel to her. I just want to thank you for your service. My son is a young Marine Corps officer, and
Semper Fi.
Semper Fi. Thank you very much. Juanetta?
All right, thanks, Meade. Okay, we do have some questions, and just as a reminder to all of our participants, you can submit a question in the chat feature at any time. If you're calling on your phone, you can submit a question via text to 907-230-2284. So General, our first question is, what is your opinion about the level of understanding of the changing operating environment in Alaska's Arctic in the Department of Defense? And do you think it's up to date? And if not, if there is an information gap, what can be done to help close that gap?
It's they're all good questions. And I think there's, for a couple of years here, there's been I won't call it an ignorance, but just not recognition of what's going on in the Arctic until about the last 2 years. And I think the incumbent administration, when they first come in, had so much on their plate, and they were so intent on doing away with anything the previous administration did that everything got thrown out the window and they started from ground zero. My point on this, for instance, is the recent appointing of this new Arctic czar. When we actually had one, when they came into office, of course, that he was a Democrat, so they fired him, but they didn't replace him. They just did away with it. And now they're starting to bring it back. So I think there's some daylight here, and there's recognition of it. And when you see what Russia's doing up there, you know, I was heavily involved in studying the Russian increases in bases and stations there. Now, let me talk about that for a second. They back in 2016, 2017, they were adding a lot of funding and putting a lot more money into the bases and stations. But they were still yet to come to the level of manning that those bases and stations had during the Cold War. You know, when the Iron Curtain came down, or ended, and the Soviet Union went away, a lot of that funding went away, and those bases just shut down, a lot of them. So now a lot of them are just bringing them back up to speed. But But Putin's got a long-term plan to reinvigorate all his bases in the Arctic. And he had the money for it until this big latest oil crisis. And that has slowed him down somewhat. So that's one point. Not that we're going to go to war against Russia in the Arctic. What they will tell you is they're putting those bases and stations there, one, to protect their own assets. And secondly, if anybody's transiting the Northwest Passage, they're going to tax them. And they also want to provide search and rescue for them as well. So that indeed is part of it. When also you look at what's going on in the Pacific and now in Norway and that whole aspect to it, and I won't call it a Cold War yet, but there's certainly our relationship with China has grown very cold, and Russia it's gotten much colder in the last 6 to 12 months. Well, Russia's major naval base, Vladivostok, it's in the Arctic, so you've got to, they're protecting that base, and so we've got to have assets that will protect against it. Hence, maybe it's a bit of a joke, but when Trump said he wanted to buy Greenland, one of the reasons was we put a base there in the GI-UK gap, which is where the Russian submarines come through. We've had a base there at Thule, Greenland for a long time. We need to protect against them coming down and coming through. So I think there's been an awakening here in the last 6 to 12 months in administration. They have written it into the Defense National Security Strategy 2018, 2019, not to the extent it had been written in the previous administration. And I mentioned the Second Fleet exercise that was recent. It's still ongoing. I don't think it ends till August 24th up north of Norway. So, I mean, the Navy is now starting to put more ships up there. They're understanding it. The Navy understands how hard it is to operate in that type of an environment. Your ships have to be hardened, and you're a little reticent to be around icebergs, as we all know why. Of course, we don't have hardly any icebreaker support. So we're starting to wake up to this, and a lot of it's threat induced, if you will, and they're starting to come out of it. So regardless of what happens in November, I think you're going to see a much more increased emphasis up there. And with the ice pack melting and more ships transiting, you're going to see a lot more involvement.
Great. Thank you so much. We have a number of questions that are around this topic, and so I'm going to try and summarize a number of them. But if Alaska is on the front line of climate change, certainly our Arctic communities and the indigenous populations there are truly at the front line of climate change. And as we've seen in the past with national security, such as during World War II, Alaska can quickly become a focal point. As the Arctic communities are dealing with climate change on a very real level on a day-to-day basis, can you speak to, in terms of your experience and looking at some of these sweeping security issues, what are the issues and concerns for these communities? And particularly one question actually points to the issues of health, of public health in the light of climate change and increasing focuses of global competition.
Yeah, I would, another good question. I would point back to the report that the Council on Foreign Relations put out in 2017, Arctic Imperatives. And in there is a pretty big section on Alaskan indigenous people and communities and their impact. In fact, we had representation on that particular task force from Alaska and from the indigenous communities. So it was a big concern. I think what I'm hearing now, but I would be interested more what you would have to say about it, is those communities are in jeopardy because the permafrost is melting, and they're literally sinking through the permafrost, and some are having to move, which is a big problem. Another problem is their energy dependence. Whether they have to import diesel or oil to burn to do it, it's expensive. There are other ways to do that, as I mentioned, having renewables, and they indeed are on the front lines too. I mean, they are impacted by this daily. They're going to see more traffic, more people coming through, more industry. There can be a positive side to that. It might be more investment in them and more employment opportunities. But on the other side, when you have industry, you have the potential for pollution and other problems that would impact them as well. So, I mean, they're on the front line, no doubt about it.
Great. We have some questions too along the lines. You mentioned the challenges of communicating in the Arctic, and I'm just wondering if you could reflect on the need for the deployment of broadband infrastructure for national security purposes in the Arctic.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to the example of Shell, which was drilling up there, as you know, and then they pulled out, and it just was not financially feasible, which when you look back on it, it was a couple of years back, probably was a pretty smart decision given the price of oil today. But with that, they took infrastructure with them or don't use it anymore. They actually brought some communications infrastructure with them, which was a real positive. There are huge gaps in communication capability, and broadband obviously is one of them. Some have mentioned put up a geosynchronous satellite that'll help expand all your communications capability in the high north, and which I think ultimately we're going to have to do that anyway. We're going to have to do it to communicate with our own ships and bases and stations. I mean, we're going to have some sort of ability to communicate with our defense establishment that's up there if they're going to be up there on a somewhat permanent basis. So I think with establishment, for instance, of a naval base, you'd have to have communication with them, although they wouldn't be all the way up there and perhaps not in the parts that are so extreme or so remote. But there is undoubtedly a need for broadband and communication long term. And in the same vein, I'll talk about the Northwest Passage, which about 70 or 75% of it is uncharted waters. I mean, you may recall a couple of years back when the Crystal Serenity sailed through it, they took their own icebreaker with them, and they had their own sonar with them in front to detect underground obstacles and icebergs. I mean, it was incredible. People don't think about that, but sooner or later it's going to be charted. Sooner or later it's going to be ice-free. And one last comment, it's kind of an oxymoron. Why would you need more icebreakers if the polar ice cap is melting? Well, the answer is you're going to have more icebergs, and you're going to have to get around them, and an icebreaker can do that, whereas a normal ship cannot. So, I mean, there's a lot of items here that need help, and certainly communications is one of them.
Great. All right, we do have a couple of other things. We are coming up close to the 1 o'clock hour, so we might go a little bit over for everybody online. But one area of question that's coming up also is simply how do we get the powers that be, other citizens in the U.S. to understand Arctic issues and to be interested and concerned in those issues as well. And related to that, continue to amplify Alaskan voices in that process.
Yeah, that's a tough one. You are somewhat remote, of course, and obviously not as populated as some other states are. But I think what this topic is particularly of interest here because I hope this state doesn't take this the wrong way. When Wyoming, when you look at Wyoming and the size of that state and the population and its participation in national security, you kind of go, they're not on the forefront of threats, international threats to our country, but Alaska is. And when we understand, certainly in this nuclear age, we've long since realized that then Soviet Union, now Russia, could launch a missile and it's coming right over the top. And the best way to prevent that, of course, is NORAD, and the best way to do that is have facilities in Alaska. But now, when you look at China and its ability, it wants to transport goods through the Northwest Passage, and it also wants resources, whether it be fishing or mining or seabed mining. And it's kind of a joke, but they know they're not an Arctic nation, but they sure want to play in the game. And it's problematic between you and me. I mean, and that's where the UNCLOS comes in here, is our economic exclusion zone, and how much land can we claim, how much can we protect, how much is ours, what are freedom of navigation operations that we can have. So Alaska's on the forefront of all of this. I can't think of another state. There is not another state that is so directly involved in these issues in the United States. There's just not another one. And you guys are the one who are on the front line. So I mean, that's going to come up more and more and more. And I think bringing it up, and certainly you've got great representation in the Senate and in the House, using those assets to push these issues and let them understand, and pushing the defense perspective on it is important for you.
Okay, we have one other question that I'll pose, and then I want to open up the floor to Lieutenant General Crum with the Alaska Command that's here with us. But let me pose this question to you first. Of course, we're aware of the Arctic Council, and there's a multitude of other bodies that are involved in Arctic policy and issues. But what sort of international intergovernmental forums do you think would be most appropriate or best suited to incorporate and address Arctic security discussion on an ongoing basis?
Yeah, I mean, both those reports I talked about address this issue specifically. And I said, whether it's some are happy or some are sad that the Arctic Council prohibits it in its charter from talking about security issues. And some say it should have been that way. That's sort of, let them look on the scientific, the academic, let them look at that side of the house, keep the military folks out of it. But from my perspective, from many, many years working in the Pentagon, that the more you talk to your adversaries, the better. The more they understand you, the better. More you have military to military contacts, the better understanding you have. It certainly prevents incidents at sea or incidents in the air when you're talking to each other. And so whatever kind of mechanism you want to use, something along the lines of an Arctic Council would be great. I mean, I think that's one way to do it, because you got the 8 Arctic countries there, and then you have observers as well, of course, that would be involved, and something along that model. The OSCE is another one, Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. The chiefs of defense, there have been meetings of chiefs of defense before, having them all meet. And that might be an easier, better way, kind of takes the diplomacy side of it out of it and puts it all in the military side. Let the military folks talk about that perspective on the security side. So, and don't, you know, I kind of laughingly talked about it, the Wild West. It's actually better governed than you would imagine. And people are obeying those strictures. There hasn't been a rampant, you know, although Russia did plant a flag, I know, under the North Pole. It was a joke, and they kind of admitted it was a joke. It's fairly well regulated. So, but the security side is not addressed. And although we've been working with Russia, and the Coast Guard has in the Bering Strait for decades, and working well, frankly, as I think most Coast Guard folks would tell you. So there are ways to do this, but there's another one, that the current atmosphere on Capitol Hill is treaty averse. It's averse to any international organizations like the UN, for instance. That's a dirty word on Capitol Hill. So I mean, it's just, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. But I think I think you see the military folks would be all in favor of it.
Okay. Well, it sounds like there's some room for improvement, or at least some detailing of the discussion to perhaps a new entity.
Sure.
And with that, let me ask Lieutenant General Crum to join us for a couple of comments. Lieutenant General Crum?
Ms. Harris, thank you. General Cheney and everyone, thank you. I don't think I could type fast enough to keep up with everything that was going on. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of issues that I think that the group might want to make sure that they focus on. And that is, all the things that General Cheney talked about are spot on when it comes to the Arctic and where we need to go. And from our vantage point, you know, all apologies to Zoom, virtual presence is actual absence. And when you see what our peers are doing in the Arctic with their infrastructure, I think what we have to understand is that we need to be there, and not temporally. So, you know, we do a lot of things with our air and and sea assets, but they're temporary in nature. And having infrastructure in which we can maintain a continuous presence will do a number of different things for us. And too often people go directly to Homeland Defense and attack and defeat. I think it's even more important to emphasize the competition part of this. And the Arctic is going to be an area of competition for a long time to come, and will be increasingly so for many different nations. And so as we look at the options that our country has for securing our interests in the Arctic, I would just encourage the group to think about looking through that lens of not just defeat, not just resources, but actually competing in the Arctic to secure our advantage. And thank you, by the way.
All right. Okay, thank you very much. All right, we are just a little past 1 o'clock. I do want to remind everybody that next week we will be having a session on the Great Power Competition. It will be at our normal time at 8 a.m. So that's August 12th, 8 a.m. And you can find that. I'll provide that link in the chat as well. And with that, let me just toss it back to Ian and Meade for any closing comments.
I just want to thank the General again and all of your support at the American Security Project for taking the time to talk with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, I also want to extend my thanks to you and to General Crum. Please don't be a stranger. There's arguments, and as we work on this, I think we got some ways we can help hone your arguments, and you've helped us hone ours. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate you and appreciate your service as well.
Thank you.